The bright city lights of New York shimmered like a galaxy on Earth. Inside the grandiose studio of the Liberty Lounge, the hottest primetime talk show in America, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Tonight's special guest? None other than the globally beloved, but always unpredictable Mr. Bean. The host, Chase Dunham, a sharp-tongued, progressive commentator known for his no-nonsense attitude and viral monologues, adjusted his tie and smirked at the camera. Chase thrived on witty banter and controversial takes. His producers had booked Mr. Bean as a wild card, a nostalgic figure meant to add a bit of quirky humor to the otherwise serious political lineup. But little did Chase know, he was about to meet his match. Backstage, Mr. Bean sat in the green room, wearing his iconic tweed jacket and skinny red tie, gleefully toying with a rubber duck he had pulled from his suitcase. He had no clue about American politics. Frankly, he didn't care. All he knew was that there were cameras, a live audience, and a chance to play. And Mr. Bean never missed an opportunity for playful chaos. A chirpy assistant popped her head in. "Mr. Bean, you're on in 5 minutes." Bean's face lit up. He stuffed the duck into his pocket, straightened his tie in his peculiar, exaggerated manner, and shuffled toward the stage entrance. "Welcome back to the Liberty Lounge." Chase beamed as the audience cheered. "Folks, tonight's guest is a comedy legend, a man whose antics have made us laugh for decades. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Bean." As the applause echoed, Mr. Bean stepped onto the stage, grinning ear to ear and waving enthusiastically. But in true Bean fashion, he tripped over a floor cable, did an awkward pirouette, and somehow managed to land safely in his chair. The crowd erupted in laughter. Chase raised an eyebrow. "Wow, you certainly know how to make an entrance, Mr. Bean." Bean adjusted his tie and gave a humble nod, his face as innocent as a schoolboy caught eating cookies before dinner. "So," Chase leaned forward, a mischievous glint in his eye, "you're known for your, unique way of handling life's little problems. Do you think your approach would work in today's politically charged world?" Bean blinked. He wasn't entirely sure what Chase meant, but he did what he always did. He improvised. He furrowed his brow, dramatically scratched his head, and pulled a mangled pamphlet from his pocket. He squinted at it, flipped it upside down, and then proudly handed it to Chase. Chase unfolded it. A children's menu from a local diner. The audience roared. Chase chuckled. "I see you've come prepared with your, policy plans. Chicken nuggets or grilled cheese?" "Bold stance, Mr. Bean." Bean nodded solemnly, as if the menu were a sacred document. Then, without a word, he snatched Chase's coffee cup, sniffed it suspiciously, and poured sugar, a mountain of sugar, into it. Chase blinked. You're really committing to this bit, huh?" Bean took a cautious sip from the sugary concoction, smacked his lips like a wine connoisseur, and gave a satisfied thumbs up. "All right," Chase said, trying to regain control. "Let's get serious for a moment. What's your take on free speech in modern America?" Bean leaned forward, as if he was about to reveal something profound. With exaggerated precision, he unzipped his tweed jacket and pulled out a squeaky toy microphone. The crowd howled as Bean tapped the toy like a reporter breaking a major scandal. He made a series of comical breaking news gestures, pointing at Chase, then at himself, then dramatically at the ceiling. Chase laughed despite himself. "I gotta hand it to you, your commitment is impressive. But surely you have an opinion. Some people say free speech is under attack. What do you say?" Bean tilted his head in thought. After a long pause, he carefully reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny British flag. With great dignity, he planted it on Chase's desk like a diplomat making a bold declaration. Chase couldn't resist. "Ah, I see. So your stance is, God save the king?" Bean clapped enthusiastically, proud that Chase had understood his message. "And what about American values?" Chase asked, still chuckling. "Do you think we've lost our sense of humor?" Bean's face turned solemn. With theatrical flair, he produced a whoopee cushion from his pocket, inflated it, and gently placed it under Chase's elbow. Chase eyed him suspiciously. "Oh no. What are you PPPPFFFFFT. The fake fart noise filled the studio. The audience lost it. Chase, despite his carefully curated persona, burst into laughter. "You know what, Mr. Bean?" Chase admitted, wiping tears from his eyes. "Maybe we do need to lighten up." Bean nodded sagely and gave himself a round of applause, encouraging the audience to do the same. As the laughter died down, Chase leaned back. "I gotta ask, how do you keep a straight face? I mean, in this crazy world, don't you ever lose your cool?" Bean considered the question. Then, ever the physical comedian, he dramatically unzipped his pants pocket and pulled out an ice pack, which he pressed solemnly to his forehead. The crowd exploded again. Chase shook his head, realizing he was completely outmatched. "You know what?" Chase laughed. "I give up. You win." Mr. Bean, triumphant, saluted the crowd, took a celebratory bite of a mystery sandwich from his pocket, and leaned back, content. And that was just the beginning. As the laughter settled, Chase Dunham straightened his tie and took a deep breath, trying to regain control of his own show. But Mr. Bean, now fully in his element, seemed determined to push the chaos even further. "All right, Mr. Bean," Chase said with a wry smile. "Since you're clearly a man of strong opinions, how about we play a little game?" Bean's eyes sparkled with mischief as he clapped his hands eagerly. Chase, sensing an opportunity to regain the upper hand, turned to the audience. "We call this game, Say It Like You Mean It. I'll read a controversial statement off the teleprompter, and Mr. Bean will give us his honest reaction." The crowd cheered as the studio lights dimmed slightly, setting the mood for their playful showdown. "Ready, Mr. Bean?" Chase asked. Bean gave a dramatic thumbs up, then pulled a pair of plastic sunglasses from his pocket and slid them onto his face, as if preparing for an interrogation. Chase chuckled and turned to the teleprompter. "Here's the first one," Chase said. "Social media companies should have the right to censor harmful opinions. What do you think, Mr. Bean?" Bean furrowed his brow and scratched his head theatrically. Then, after a moment of deep thought, he mimed typing on an invisible keyboard. With exaggerated horror, he pretended to get electrocuted by it, shaking violently before collapsing over Chase's desk. The audience erupted in laughter. Chase laughed despite himself. "I take that as a no, then?" Bean popped back up, gave a sharp nod, and pointed an accusing finger at the teleprompter, as if it had personally offended him. Okay, Chase grinned. "Here's an easier one. Everyone should drive electric cars by 2030. Your thoughts?" Bean's face brightened as he reached under the desk and, to everyone's shock, pulled out a tiny remote control car. He set it on the table and pressed a button, causing it to zoom wildly across the surface. With the reflexes of a cat, he snatched it midair before it tumbled off. Chase raised an eyebrow. "So, electric cars are good?" Bean shook his head furiously. He then mimed pedaling a bicycle, huffing and puffing like he was climbing a mountain. To punctuate his point, he wiped fake sweat from his forehead and flashed a winning smile at the audience. "I see," Chase mused, playing along. "You'd rather stick with pedal power. Bold choice in this economy." Bean pointed at his legs and flexed an imaginary muscle, clearly proud of his strength. "Okay, one more," Chase said, determined to stump him. "Late-night hosts like me are totally unbiased. What do you say?" Without missing a beat, Bean whipped out a tiny hand mirror from his jacket and held it up to Chase's face. The crowd howled as Bean exaggeratedly polished the mirror, as if to help Chase see himself more clearly. Chase leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "I gotta hand it to you. You're really committed to this chaos." Bean grinned innocently, as if he had no idea what Chase meant. "Well," Chase continued, "since you're clearly an expert in mischief, how about you try reading the teleprompter?" At this, Bean's eyes widened with excitement. He shot up from his chair and bounded toward the teleprompter like a child on Christmas morning. "Okay, Mr. Bean," Chase said, suppressing a chuckle. "Just read the next line." Bean squinted at the glowing words, tilted his head like a confused puppy, and began speaking in a comically exaggerated British accent. I am Chase Dunham, and I think my hair is amazing. The audience erupted with laughter as Chase shook his head. Hey, that's not what it says. Bean gasped, feigning shock. He turned to the teleprompter, adjusted his jacket, and pointed accusingly at it, as if the machine itself had betrayed him. Without skipping a beat, he reached into his pocket and produced a roll of duct tape. Wait, what are you doing? Chase exclaimed. Bean shuffled toward the teleprompter and, to the audience's delight, slapped a huge piece of duct tape across the screen, as if to silence the offensive words. Problem solved, Chase said, barely holding back laughter. I guess free speech has its limits after all. Bean gave a triumphant nod, dusted off his hands, and strutted back to his chair like a victorious gladiator. Chase shook his head in disbelief. Mr. Bean, you've managed to do the impossible. You've broken my show. Bean's face lit up with pride as he gave himself a standing ovation, urging the audience to clap louder. Chase leaned forward, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. I gotta ask, do you even understand what this show is about? Bean tilted his head in confusion. This is a political talk show, Chase explained. We debate serious issues. Do you even follow politics? At this, Bean's face turned deadly serious. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled newspaper, and carefully unfolded it. The headline read, Dog wins local mayoral election. Chase blinked. That's not exactly what I meant. Bean shrugged and patted the newspaper affectionately, as if it were a piece of hard-hitting journalism. Okay. You know what? Chase laughed, throwing up his hands. You're officially the most unpredictable guest we've ever had. Bean beamed, pulling a golden #1 ribbon from his pocket and pinning it proudly to his jacket. As the camera panned to the roaring audience, Chase shook his head with a grin. I don't know how we're gonna top this, folks, but we'll try. Stick around. And with that, the show cut to commercial, but everyone knew the real show had only just begun. As the show returned from the commercial break, Chase Dunham leaned forward in his chair, still shaking his head in disbelief. Across from him, Mr. Bean sat proudly, his #1 ribbon glinting under the studio lights, swinging his legs like a schoolboy who had just outsmarted his teacher. Welcome back to the Liberty Lounge, where tonight, the laws of sanity have officially left the building, Chase quipped. Now, Mr. Bean, since you're clearly an expert in mischief, I thought we'd bring out someone who's, let's say, not so amused by your antics. At that moment, the side door swung open, and in walked Eleanor Bright, a no-nonsense political analyst known for her fiery monologues and razor-sharp opinions. With her sleek power suit and air of authority, she was the exact opposite of Mr. Bean's chaotic energy. The audience applauded politely as Eleanor settled into the chair next to Bean. She glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Bean, in response, gave her an exaggeratedly polite bow, nearly falling out of his chair in the process. Ms. Bright, Chase began, suppressing a smile. You're known for being one of the sharpest voices in progressive media. What do you make of Mr. Bean's, shall we say, unconventional approach to the issues? Eleanor crossed her arms and sighed. Look, it's easy to laugh at silly antics, but at the end of the day, we're talking about serious problems facing this country. Climate change, wealth inequality, attacks on free speech. These aren't jokes. Bean listened intently, nodding as though he deeply understood every word. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a banana. Chase blinked. Mr. Bean, why do you have a banana? Bean, as serious as a judge, slowly and carefully peeled the banana, as if it were the solution to all of America's problems. He then held it up like a microphone and pointed it toward Eleanor, encouraging her to continue. The audience burst into laughter, but Eleanor was not impressed. See, this is the problem, she snapped. People like you turn serious conversations into punchlines. It's no wonder people don't trust the media anymore. Bean tilted his head, pretending to process her words. Then, with great ceremony, he offered her the banana, as if it were a peace offering. I don't want the banana, Eleanor said, her voice tightening. But Bean, ever persistent, leaned closer and waved the banana gently under her nose. Chase, nearly doubled over with laughter, finally intervened. Okay, let's try something else. Mr. Bean, let's hear your opinion. Do you think the media is too biased these days? Bean's face turned solemn. He pulled out a toy magnifying glass and began inspecting Chase's coffee mug with exaggerated seriousness. After a dramatic pause, he held up a sugar packet and carefully balanced it on top, as if it represented the delicate balance of truth. Chase clapped his hands. Ah, I see, truth is fragile. Am I right? Bean nodded enthusiastically, giving the mug a little pat for encouragement. Eleanor sighed deeply. This is ridiculous. People like you don't understand how hard we work to deliver facts. What's your solution, Mr. Bean? Should we just let anyone say whatever they want? Bean's eyes lit up with an idea. From his pocket, he pulled out a toy megaphone and pressed the button. It let out a hilariously distorted fart noise that echoed across the studio. The audience erupted as Eleanor's jaw dropped in horror. You see, Chase laughed, wiping a tear from his eye. He believes in total free expression. Bean gave an exaggerated salute, clearly proud of himself. But Eleanor, unwilling to be outdone, leaned forward. Okay, Mr. Bean, if you're so smart, what's your plan for fixing misinformation online? Without missing a beat, Bean reached into his jacket and pulled out a giant pink eraser labeled Big Mistakes. With theatrical flair, he erased the air in front of Eleanor, as if wiping misinformation from existence. Chase lost it. I mean, honestly, that's more effective than some fact-checkers I know. Eleanor threw up her hands. I can't do this. This is absurd. Sensing her frustration, Bean decided to extend an olive branch, or rather, an actual olive, which he fished out from his jacket pocket and held out to her on a toothpick. The audience howled as Eleanor, despite herself, cracked a smile. You're unbelievable, she muttered, shaking her head. Chase clapped his hands together. Well, I think we've learned something important tonight. Sometimes, the best way to handle serious debates is to laugh through the madness. Bean gave a dignified nod, then pulled a party popper from his sleeve and set it off, sending a shower of confetti across Eleanor's lap. As the studio rang with laughter, Chase leaned toward the camera. Don't go anywhere. We're coming back with Mr. Bean versus social media right after the break. Bean, clearly on a roll, leaned into the mic and whispered dramatically, boom. As the show returned from the break, the camera zoomed in on Mr. Bean, who had somehow managed to snag Chase Dunham's coffee mug. He examined it closely, as if it held the key to solving all of society's problems. When Chase reclaimed the mug with a playful glare, Bean pouted like a scolded child, much to the audience's delight. Welcome back to the Liberty Lounge, Chase said, still chuckling. We're here with the one and only Mr. Bean, who has, against all odds, turned tonight's serious discussion into a circus. And now, Mr. Bean, it's time to talk about everyone's favorite battleground, social media. Bean perked up, reaching into his jacket and pulling out an old-school flip phone. With a proud grin, he held it up as if unveiling a cutting-edge gadget. Chase shook his head in amusement. Mr. Bean, that's not exactly social media. Undeterred, Bean flipped the phone open with a dramatic snap and began pretending to type with furious intensity, using all 10 fingers at once. He then lifted the phone to his ear and struck a super serious businessman pose. So, what's your opinion? Chase asked. Should people be allowed to say whatever they want online? Bean paused, squinted thoughtfully, then raised one finger, the universal I have an idea gesture. From under the desk, he pulled out a giant red mute button and slammed it theatrically. The audience roared as Chase leaned forward. So, your solution is to mute the nonsense? Bean nodded vigorously and mimed zipping his lips shut, locking them with an invisible key and tossing the imaginary key over his shoulder. Well, that's one way to handle it, Chase laughed. But what about free speech? Shouldn't everyone have a voice? At this, Bean's eyes widened in mock horror. He grabbed a rubber chicken from his pocket and squeezed it, making it let out a loud, ridiculous squawk. With perfect timing, he pointed at the camera, as if to suggest that this is what most social media discourse sounds like. Eleanor Bright, still sitting nearby with her arms crossed, sighed. Oh, please. It's easy to mock, but social media is how people stay informed. The problem is that bad actors spread misinformation faster than truth. Bean cocked his head, pretending to process her words. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he pulled out a tangled mess of cords and held them up, as if to suggest how confusing online information has become. Chase laughed. Let me guess. You think the internet is a mess? Bean nodded solemnly and carefully attempted to untangle the cords, only to make the mess even worse. Finally, in frustration, he simply threw the whole knot over his shoulder and dusted off his hands. You know what? Chase said. I kind of agree with him. Sometimes the best thing to do is log off and touch grass. At this, Bean's face lit up with an idea. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small potted plant. With great care, he placed it on Chase's desk and gave it an encouraging pat, his version of touching grass. Where do you even get these props? Chase laughed, shaking his head. Eleanor, unwilling to let Bean have the last laugh, leaned forward. Fine. If you're so smart, Mr. Bean, what would you do to fix social media? Bean gave her a long, thoughtful look, then pulled out a roll of duct tape again, and dramatically taped his own mouth shut. The audience howled as Chase slapped his desk in laughter. So your solution is to just silence yourself? Bean gave a sad nod, then theatrically wiped away an imaginary tear, as if the burden of silence was too much to bear. But that's the thing, Chase mused, regaining composure. Social media isn't going anywhere. People are always going to argue. Isn't that just part of free speech? Bean pondered the question seriously. After a pause, he grabbed a toy referee's whistle from his pocket, stood up, and blew it loudly, declaring himself the official peacekeeper of the internet. Chase burst out laughing. I mean, honestly, I trust Mr. Bean over half the fact-checkers out there. Eleanor rolled her eyes. This is all very funny, but people like you make light of real issues. You think social media is a game, Mr. Bean? At this, Bean perked up and reached under his chair, producing an actual board game titled Internet Madness. He held it up proudly, as if it were the obvious solution to online chaos. Is that even a real game? Chase asked, barely able to contain himself. Bean shrugged innocently and proceeded to open the box. Inside were absurd game pieces like a tiny troll figurine, a broken heart emoji, and a plastic megaphone. Without missing a beat, Bean handed the troll to Eleanor, which earned him another wave of laughter. You're just giving me the troll piece because I disagree with you, Eleanor said, struggling to hide a smirk. Bean nodded enthusiastically and mimed awarding her a trophy, much to the audience's delight. Chase wiped his eyes. Okay, one last question before we wrap this madness up. Mr. Bean, what's your final message for anyone taking social media too seriously? Bean stood up, dusted off his jacket, and pulled out a tiny chalkboard. With painstaking effort, he scribbled the words, "Be nice, or else." The crowd erupted in cheers as Bean, with dramatic flair, snapped the chalkboard shut and gave a polite bow. Chase stood, applauding. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the one and only Mr. Bean, the voice of reason we never knew we needed. As the audience gave a standing ovation, Bean took a victory lap around the stage, tossing plastic gold medals into the crowd like a chaotic Santa Claus. And with that, Chase concluded, barely containing his laughter, we'll see you next time, if the network doesn't fire me first. With a final wink to the camera, Mr. Bean triumphantly tooted on his toy megaphone, leaving behind a trail of confetti and chaos as the screen faded to black. The audience was still buzzing with laughter as the final segment of the Liberty Lounge kicked off. Chase Dunham leaned back in his chair, struggling to regain his composure while Mr. Bean sat cross-legged on his seat, wearing Chase's reading glasses upside down and pretending to analyze a stack of cue cards. "All right, folks," Chase said, wiping a tear from his eye. "We've tackled politics, media bias, and the madness of social media, but now it's time for the moment you've all been waiting for. Mr. Bean, it's time to deliver your roast." The crowd cheered wildly as a dramatic drum roll played. Mr. Bean perked up like a kid on Christmas morning. He carefully removed Chase's glasses, tucking them neatly into his own pocket, and stood up, adjusting his tweed jacket as if preparing for a presidential address. Eleanor Bright crossed her arms and smirked. "Oh, this should be good." Bean gave her a polite nod, then immediately tripped over the microphone cable, sending himself tumbling into the podium. The audience roared as he popped back up, unfazed, and tapped the mic to check if it was working. Tap, tap, honk. Yes, he had swapped the mic with a bicycle horn. Chase clapped his hands in delight. "You've already won, Bean. Just take the victory lap." But Mr. Bean wasn't finished. With exaggerated seriousness, he cleared his throat, pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper, and began his roast, delivering it without a single word in his usual silent, chaotic style. Bean held up a drawing of Chase, except the cartoon version had an impossibly large mouth and a tiny brain. The audience erupted in laughter as Chase snatched the picture away. "Hey, my brain is at least average-sized." Bean, ever the perfectionist, flipped the paper over, revealing a new drawing of a megaphone on legs, with the words, "Talks too much." Chase burst out laughing. "Okay, you got me there." 2. Roasting Eleanor Bright. Turning to Eleanor, Bean gave her a long, thoughtful stare, before pulling out a stopwatch and dramatically pressing the button. Tick, tick, tick. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked, raising an eyebrow. Bean pantomimed checking the time, then pulled out a toy turtle and placed it on the podium. The audience howled with laughter as Chase clued in. "Wait, are you saying she's too slow to change her mind?" Bean nodded enthusiastically, giving Eleanor a participation ribbon that read, "World's fastest snail." Even Eleanor couldn't suppress a chuckle. "All right, I walked into that one." 3. Roasting social media. Next, Bean turned his attention to social media. He produced a fishbowl filled with scraps of paper, shaking it for the audience to see. Chase leaned forward. "What's that supposed to be?" Bean held up a sign that read, "Hot takes, handle with care." He then blindly pulled out a slip of paper which said, "Pineapple on pizza is a crime." With mock horror, he clutched his heart and pretended to faint, sending the bowl flying and scattering the hot takes everywhere. "That's about right," Chase laughed. The internet won overreaction at a Tim. For his next trick, Bean pulled out a comically large eraser labeled, "Cancel culture, for big mistakes only." He strutted toward Chase and dramatically tried to erase him, sending the audience into fits of laughter. "I knew this day would come," Chase joked. "I'm being erased by a British icon." Bean, unsatisfied with the results, then pulled out a miniature guillotine and pantomimed cutting off Chase's career, giving an exaggerated thumbs up afterward. 5. Roasting himself. Finally, Bean turned the joke on himself. He held up a framed photo of himself, with googly eyes glued on top. Chase shook his head. "You're roasting yourself?" Bean nodded solemnly and displayed a sign that read, "Clueless, but adorable." The audience erupted as Bean took an exaggerated curtain bow, nearly falling off the stage in the process. The grand finale, Bean's mic drop moment. With the crowd still roaring, Bean produced a golden envelope marked, "Mr. Bean's final thought." Chase, curious, leaned closer. "What wisdom are you about to drop on us, Bean?" With exaggerated flair, Bean ripped open the envelope and pulled out a small card. In bold, glittery letters, it simply said, "Lighten up, America." The room exploded with laughter and applause as Bean grabbed a party popper and set it off, sending a cloud of glitter raining down on everyone. Chase stood, clapping. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bean has officially won the night." As the credits rolled, Bean pulled a toy crown from his jacket, placed it on his head, and waved to the crowd like a mischievous king, ending his roast with a final, triumphant flourish. The legacy of the roast. By the next morning, #BeanRoastsAmerica was trending nationwide. Clips of his antics spread across social media. His banana microphone, the mute button, and Lighten Up America becoming instant memes. Liberal and conservative audiences alike couldn't help but agree. Sometimes the best way to survive the chaos was to laugh at it. And Mr. Bean? He simply returned to his quiet life, content knowing that, once again, his silent genius had stolen the show.